There's a story about vanilla that smells sweet, sounds exotic, and is completely false. A story about Aztec children climbing trees at dawn, slashing seed pods with their fingernails, creating the flavor that made emperors weep. The tale claims that in 1427, Tenochtitlan's chocolate guilds enslaved children to hand-pollinate wild vanilla orchids, flowers that supposedly opened for only 4 hours, once per year, 60 feet above the jungle floor. According to the myth, each pod required a precise slash in exactly the right spot, or the beans would rot into toxic slime instead of curing into that leather-sweet aroma that flavored Montezuma's legendary drinking chocolate. This story has been repeated in food blogs, chocolate shop plaques, and even some cookbooks. It combines everything we want to believe: ancient wisdom, difficult luxury, and a hint of darkness. But here's what actually happened, and why the truth is far stranger than the fiction. Vanilla orchids don't grow 60 feet in the air. They're vines that climb, yes, but pollination happens at eye level. The flowers don't open once per year. They bloom in succession over weeks. The Aztecs never pollinated vanilla at all. They didn't need to. In the Mexican forests where vanilla originated, a tiny native bee called Melipona does the work naturally. So why does this elaborate lie exist? Why did someone invent barefoot child slaves and toxic slime and fingernail slashing techniques that never happened? The answer begins not in 1427 Tenochtitlan, but on a small island in the Indian Ocean, 2 centuries after Montezuma's death, where vanilla became the most valuable substance on Earth, and where a 12-year-old enslaved boy named Edmund Albius discovered something in 1841 that European botanists couldn't figure out for decades, and got none of the credit. This is the story of how vanilla's real history, full of actual slavery, colonial theft, and a child's genius, got buried under a romantic Aztec fantasy that never existed. The title of this documentary is a complete lie. There were no vanilla slave orchid climbers in 1427, but the truth about what the Aztecs actually did with vanilla is so strange, it makes the fiction seem boring. First problem: vanilla orchids don't grow on 60-foot rainforest trees. They grow as vines on the forest floor. Second problem: the Aztecs never hand-pollinated them. They didn't need to. In Central America, there's a tiny stingless bee called Melipona. For thousands of years, it was the only creature on Earth that could pollinate vanilla. The Aztecs didn't climb trees. They followed bees. But here's where it gets weird. The Aztecs didn't use vanilla to make chocolate taste sweet. They used it to make chocolate taste like blood. Montezuma's chocolate was nothing like what you're imagining. It was bitter, spiced with chili peppers, and whisked into a froth with human blood from ritual sacrifices. The vanilla wasn't flavoring, it was medicine. The Aztec word for vanilla is Tlaxochitl, black flower. They believed it had the power to calm the mind before battle and sharpen the senses before ritual. Warriors drank it, priests drank it, sacrifices drank it. So why did I start with that ridiculous story about child slaves and toxic slime? Because that story, or versions of it, actually exists in dozens of chocolate company marketing materials and food blogs today. The vanilla industry has been lying about its history for over 150 years, and the lies started with one 12-year-old enslaved boy on an island in the Indian Ocean who actually did change everything. His name was Edmund Albius. In 1841, on the French colony of Réunion, he invented the hand pollination technique that broke vanilla free from the Melipona bee and from Mexico. He was never paid. He died in poverty. That's the real story. Not Aztec tree climbers, but enslaved child whose genius created a global industry worth $600 million today, an industry that still relies on his technique, still uses exploitative labor, and still tells fantasy stories about ancient civilizations. So let's go back to Tenochtitlan, 1427. Not to the fantasy version, but to what actually happened when the Aztecs encountered a flower that would eventually become the world's most labor-intensive spice. Everything you just heard about Aztec vanilla slavery? Complete fiction. The Aztecs never hand-pollinated vanilla. They didn't need to. Wild vanilla in Mesoamerica pollinated itself through native Melipona bees. The orchids climbed trees naturally. No human intervention required. But there was a vanilla slavery scandal. It just happened 4 centuries later, on a different continent entirely. In 1841, a 12-year-old enslaved boy named Edmond Albius on the French island of Réunion discovered how to hand-pollinate vanilla. Vanilla orchids had been transplanted from Mexico decades earlier but refused to produce pods. No Melipona bees existed outside the Americas. Edmund used a thin bamboo sliver and his thumb to lift the flower's rostellum, pressing anther to stigma. Every vanilla bean now comes from this technique. Within 20 years, Madagascar became the world's vanilla capital. The industry was built on plantation slavery and later exploitative colonial labor. Here's the twist that makes this story even darker. Edmund Albius received no compensation, no patent, no recognition during his lifetime. The man who revolutionized a billion-dollar global industry died in poverty in 1880. His gravestone wasn't erected until 1980, a century later. Today, Madagascar produces 80% of the world's vanilla. Most farmers earn less than $2 per day. Hand pollination is still required for every single flower. Each orchid blooms for just 6 hours. Each flower must be pollinated by hand on that exact day, or the opportunity is lost forever. This is why vanilla is the second most expensive spice after saffron. Not because of Aztec tree-climbing children, but because of colonial exploitation and grueling labor. The mythology of ancient vanilla slavery obscures the real history, an enslaved child's genius stolen and monetized by empires that never compensated him. So when you taste vanilla, remember, you're not experiencing Aztec luxury. You're tasting the unacknowledged brilliance of Edmund Albius and centuries of exploitation. Let's talk about what vanilla flowers actually do, because this entire myth collapses the moment you understand vanilla botany. Vanilla flowers don't open once per year. They bloom sequentially over weeks, sometimes months. Each individual flower opens for just one day, not 4 hours, then dies. And they don't grow 60 feet up in rainforest canopy trees. Vanilla is a climbing orchid that grows on tree trunks, usually starting at ground level. Here's the part that completely destroys the barefoot child climber story. Vanilla is native to Mexico, yes, but it pollinated itself just fine for millions of years. A tiny species of stingless bee, Melipona, and certain hummingbirds did the pollination work. No human intervention needed, no climbers, no guilds. The Aztecs didn't hand-pollinate vanilla because they didn't need to. Wild vanilla produced pods prolifically in its native range with its native pollinators. Hand pollination of vanilla only became necessary in the 1800s, when Europeans tried growing it outside Mexico, in places like Madagascar and Réunion, without its natural pollinators. A 12-year-old enslaved boy named Edmund Albius invented the hand pollination technique in 1841 on Réunion, 4 centuries after the Aztec Empire fell. As for slashing pods with fingernails, that's not pollination. That's not even close to how vanilla processing works. Vanilla beans are harvested when green and whole, then cured through a weeks-long process of sweating and sun-drying. No slashing, no fingernails, no toxic slime. The sweet leather smell develops from enzymatic processes during curing. It has nothing to do with how the pod is opened and everything to do with controlled fermentation. So we have flowers that don't bloom once yearly, trees that don't need climbing, pollination that happen naturally, and a processing method invented 400 years too late. What we're left with is a fiction that borrows real elements, Aztec chocolate, vanilla's value, child labor in colonial plantations, and scrambles them into impossible timeline. But if the botany is wrong and the timeline is wrong, where did this story come from, and why does it sound so convincing? The Florentine Codex, written by Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún in 1590, preserves the actual recipe Montezuma drank. Not a single mention of vanilla appears in it. The recipe calls for cacao, ground maize, chili peppers, and achiote. The drink was bitter, spicy, served cold, and according to conquistador accounts, completely unpalatable to European tongues. Here's what that recipe reveals. Vanilla wasn't part of Aztec chocolate culture at all. It couldn't have been. Vanilla orchids are native to Mexico, yes, but they grow in coastal lowland forests, hundreds of miles from Tenochtitlan's highland plateau at 7,350 feet elevation. The Totonac people of Veracruz cultivated vanilla as tribute, but they used it in completely different ways, as incense, perfume, and medicine, never with chocolate. The marriage of vanilla and chocolate didn't happen until 1602, in a Spanish monastery 75 years after the Aztec Empire fell. But the myth we've been told insists vanilla was essential to Montezuma's ritual. Why would such a specific lie take root and flourish for centuries? Because vanilla became the second most expensive spice in the world, and expensive things need expensive stories. The pollination problem was real, though. Vanilla orchids evolved alongside a specific Mexican bee species. Outside their native range, the flowers withered unpollinated. For 3 centuries after Europeans discovered vanilla, every bean sold worldwide came from a tiny strip of Mexican coastline. Colonial powers tried transplanting it everywhere and failed completely. Then in 1841, a 12-year-old enslaved boy on Reunion Island named Edmund Albius discovered he could pollinate vanilla by hand using a bamboo sliver and his thumb. This is where the real story of child labor and vanilla begins, not in mythical Aztec chocolate guilds, but in French colonial plantations that enslaved actual documented children. Edmund's technique spread to Madagascar, which still produces 80% of the world's vanilla. The hand pollination is still done the same way, one flower at a time, during a 4-hour morning window. Each flower blooms only once. Each vanilla vine produces flowers for just 8 weeks per year. Miss your window and you get nothing. After pollination, the pods grow for 9 months, then must be harvested at precisely the right moment, still green, just before splitting. Then comes the curing, a 4-month process of daily sun exposure and night sweating wrapped in blankets. This is when vanilla develops that smell, through controlled fermentation, not slashing. The fingernail slashing story? That's a garbled version of a real technique used in the final curing stage, scoring the beans to check moisture content, not to prevent toxic rot. So here's what Montezuma's chocolate recipe actually reveals. We buried a real history of colonial child exploitation beneath a fantasy of Aztec chocolate guilds that never existed. None of this happened. Not the slave children, not the 60-foot climbs, not the once-a-year flowers or the fingernail slashing ritual. Vanilla didn't even grow near Tenochtitlan. It's a lowland crop from the Veracruz coast, 200 miles away. The Totonac people cultivated vanilla, not as slaves but as master agriculturalists who developed the entire curing process. They traded it to the Aztecs as tribute, dried, processed, ready to use. No midnight climbing required. Vanilla orchids grow on trees, yes, but as vines that farmers deliberately cultivate at chest height. The flowers open for 1 day, not 4 hours, and they bloom in waves over months, not once per year. Here's what actually made vanilla valuable. Until 1841, only one species of tiny Melipona bee could pollinate it, and only in Mexico. When Europeans stole the plants, nothing would fruit, until a 12-year-old enslaved boy named Edmund Albius invented hand pollination. But here's the pattern we keep falling for. Take a real colonial atrocity, like Edmund Albius dying in poverty after his French masters stole credit for his invention, and project it backward onto the civilization you're trying to justify conquering. The Spanish needed their genocide to look like rescue, so vanilla cultivation became child slavery, tribute systems became torture, advanced hydraulic agriculture became barbarism requiring European salvation. We invented the Aztec vanilla slave orchid climbers, the same way we invented Montezuma's skull cup and the 80,000 heart per day sacrifice statistics. By taking real colonial violence, reversing the perpetrators and victims, and repeating it until it sounds like history. The real story was remarkable enough. The Totonac developed a cultivation technique so sophisticated that it took the rest of the world 300 years to replicate. They created one of the world's most complex flavors through careful curing, a biochemical marvel. But remarkable indigenous achievement doesn't justify conquest. Invented barbarism does. So the story we told ourselves, and keep telling, isn't about vanilla at all. It's about permission. Every time we share a wild historical claim without checking sources, we're not just spreading misinformation. We're granting retroactive permission for atrocities by making the victims sound like they deserved it. The vanilla that flavors your ice cream today? It probably came from Madagascar, hand-pollinated, using the technique that enslaved 12-year-old invented and never profited from. That's the real story of exploitation we should be telling. The Aztecs had genuine flaws worth examining: imperialism, human sacrifice, rigid hierarchies. But we don't need to invent fantasy atrocities when real history is complicated enough. The truth doesn't need embellishment to be worth learning. So why do we keep believing these stories? Because they're designed to be believable, exotic enough to be fascinating, dark enough to be memorable, and just vague enough that we don't think to verify them. They're engineered to spread. The antidote isn't cynicism, it's curiosity. When a historical claim sounds perfectly designed to confirm what you already believe about the past, that's exactly when you should dig deeper. The real story is usually more interesting anyway. There were no Aztec vanilla slave orchid climbers, but there were Totonac master cultivators. There was Edmund Albius, child genius. There were Melipona bees, tiny engineers of flavor. And there's us, deciding which stories to carry forward. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out other videos.